Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Annie Kennett Nichols, and I work with OLLI at Emory. I'm here to introduce Stephen Harbour. He's doing a class in October on censorship in the U.S. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, Annie.
How are you?
Fine, fine.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My
Um,
pleasure.
could you tell us a little bit about the class you're going to be teaching?
Yeah, it's 6 sessions focusing on censorship. I introduced the course with a 1 hour session on what I call a brief history of censorship in the movies. So we talk about first starting what the courts did and restricting movies back when they first came out in the 1800 and early 1900s, and then about how the Hays Code and that period and code and pre-code and all that. And then I talk about, or we talk about how the courts intervened and how that censorship fell apart. It's interesting, as I'll talk about in the course, the city of Atlanta played a fairly prominent role in all of this, actually, and we'll talk about what the city did. After that, I moved to what I call censorship during periods of war, rebellion, and insurrection. And we'll talk about which is sort of the best case for censorship. We'll start with the old Sedition Act in 1787, which was one of the first cases, and you may have learned about in history books. And we'll go through World War One, World War Two, and we'll bring it up to current. And then we'll talk about some Supreme Court decisions about people advocating violence and what you can punish in that, which has some relationship. I'm not going to turn this into a course about it, but has some relationship to current events. The third session will be on censorship of newspapers, TV, and cable. Well, again, early on, the government actually tried to censor what newspapers could do and what they could say. And we'll talk about that legal battle. And then there's a case called, which a lot of people are familiar with, New York Times v. Sullivan, which talked about censoring newspapers not through direct government regulation, but using libel laws to censor. And we'll talk about that case and a couple other cases. And then we'll finish by talking about Dominion voting versus Fox News, which is the case which was recently brought by Dominion voting, challenging the commentary on Fox News about the election and how that played out. It was ultimately settled, but there was some court decisions. So we have some good basic information on what happened there. And so we'll bring that. And so it's sort of at this point about half, primarily a lot of history, but bringing up to current events. And then we move more into social media. The next session is on threats, hate speech, and misinformation. There's been a recent Supreme Court decision on what constitutes a threat of violence and when you can prosecute somebody for making a threat of violence. We'll talk about hate speech, and we'll talk about the whole debate about misinformation and that type of thing. And there are really two questions here. One is always the question of, well, can the government regulate a speaker, a person who makes a threat? Which is the answer to that is threat of violence, yes, but under what conditions? Can they regulate hate speech? Can they regulate a person making information? And then there's another underlying question, which the new technology of social platforms and the internet have brought about, is should the social platform, should Facebook be responsible for threats and hate speech and misinformation published on its network? So there's two questions in regard, both can the government prosecute the individual or punish the individual who engages in this, but can also require the social platforms to become a censor in that sense. Um, and that leads us to another discussion about about social platforms, which is the question of whether you can have the censor platforms can be prohibited from censoring people. Both Texas and Florida have passed laws that say that it's now illegal for Facebook under certain circumstances to prohibit conversations on their networks and type of things. And both of those cases are challenged before the United States Supreme Court. So we'll talk about that, whether or not what the state of the law is and the uncertainty of it. And then the other thing is what's been recently in the news is when government officials call these people, Facebook or whatever, and either cajole, persuade, or pressure, depending on your political persuasion, I guess, and your view of what they're talking about, and whether or not they can, what are the limits on that? And again, the courts have intervened, and that's again in the Supreme Court. So that's that section. And then the final section is on education. which is the censorship. First, we'll talk about removing or banning, getting into terminology here, of books from school, high school, particularly high school libraries and that type of thing. The second, we'll also talk about limitations on what student speech and student demonstrations, both in high school and in college type thing. There's several Supreme Court cases on that, including a recent one about a cheerleader, a little girl who, I shouldn't call it a woman who, a little girl who was a cheerleader, ninth grader, and who tweeted some negative statements about cheerleading and went all the way to the Supreme Court. And then we'll talk about the recent efforts to control what is actually used as part of the curriculum and punishing professors for what they may say either in court, in class, or out of class, and trying to regulate that, particularly at state universities, which is going on in Florida. So that's a nutshell. I think that's what we pose to do. And how we plan to cover it.
Great. That is a lot. I love it. I look forward to seeing your class. And thank you so much for your time today.
Okay, thank you.
Take care.
Okay, is that okay? We're off now.